She called me a serpent, in front of him, in front of our baby. Like I slithered into their family uninvited, poisoned their bloodline, corrupted their son. And he said nothing, not a word, not a flinch, not even a look in my direction like I wasn't worth defending. That was the moment I stopped waiting to be saved. Because the man who once swore he'd protect me stood still as his mother carved my name into a curse. It didn't start like this. They never do. In the beginning, she smiled, asked sweet questions, brought me tea with a bitter aftertaste, laughed too hard too long at nothing I said. And I was desperate to belong. So I ignored the tension, dismissed the small jabs as nervousness, told myself she just needs time. But time didn't soften her. It sharpened her into a dagger cloaked in pearls. She didn't call me by my name. She called me that girl, her, the one you're wasting your life on. And when I gave her a grandchild, she still looked at me like I had stolen something, something that could never be returned. My body bore the weight of a family she swore I didn't deserve. And still I smiled at her, set the table, offered the seat closest to the head. Because I thought love meant enduring. I thought being good would win her over. I thought silence could earn respect. But silence only fed her cruelty. She made herself the victim, masterfully, tears on command, innocent tones soaked in poison. She would whisper lies to him when I wasn't looking, twist my words into weapons, play the martyr while I was painted as the manipulator. She doesn't respect tradition, she's too independent, she's changing you. Yes, I was. I was trying to free him from the umbilical cord she never cut, trying to help him become a man, not just her obedient little boy. But she couldn't bear to lose control, so she turned me into the villain in a story she'd been rewriting since the day we met. He started doubting me, questioning things he never would have before. Why don't you want to visit her this weekend? Couldn't you just let that comment go? She didn't mean it that way. But I had heard her tone, the blade tucked behind every word, the way she smiled with her mouth and stabbed with her eyes. She once told me he'll always be mine before he's yours. And I believed her. Because every time I cried, he chose her comfort over my pain. I began to disappear inside our home. Not physically, no. I still made the meals, folded, the laundry, raised our child. But my laughter faded, my softness hardened, my words became scarce. Because I learned that anything I said could and would be used against me, especially when whispered into the ear of a man too afraid to stand tall. She didn't need to ruin our marriage outright. She just needed to plant enough doubt and water it quietly with every family dinner. And he let her. The breaking point came one night when I overheard her on speakerphone. She didn't know I was there, didn't know the baby monitor was on, didn't care. She said, "She's ruining you. Look at you, you don't even smile anymore. She's turning you into someone none of us recognize." And he agreed. "I know, Mom, I know." My breath caught, not because of what she said I expected that, but because he echoed it. Because the man I had held through his darkest moments now painted me as the reason for his unhappiness. That night, I didn't cry. I sat in the nursery holding our child and I made a silent promise. I will not let my daughter grow up watching her mother be erased. I will not teach her that love means silence, that survival means swallowing pain, that being a wife means becoming invisible. I looked into my baby's eyes and I saw the line that would not be crossed. The next morning I wore red, not the soft kind, not the polite shade tucked into florals and lipstick. I wore war red, blood red. She came for brunch, of course, unannounced as always. She had a key. He said it made things easier. Easier for whom? I watched her walk in like she owned the walls, like she could rearrange my life the way she rearranged the furniture when I was in the shower one day and came out to find the sofa moved. "Just a better angle for the light," she said. I stood there still in that red dress, my daughter on my hip, and smiled the kind of smile women only wear when they've chosen violence without raising a hand. She said, "Oh, you dressed up." And I said, "I bury things in this color." Her eyes flickered, just for a second, but I saw it, the moment she realized the game was about to shift. I didn't yell, didn't scream, I simply started undoing her, quietly, precisely. I began documenting every insult, every manipulation, every time she inserted herself into decisions that were never hers to make. I recorded her slips of the tongue, her backhanded comments dressed as compliments, the time she said in front of my child, "Your mother's too sensitive. I hope you grow up more like your father's side." She thought I was too emotional, but I was just collecting evidence, not for a courtroom, for the day he'd finally ask what happened. I wanted to have more than memory. I wanted proof of the quiet war she'd waged on my sanity. I started going to therapy alone. He said we didn't need it, that she'd ease up eventually, but I wasn't going for her. I was going to stop believing I was the problem. Because somewhere along the way, I began gaslighting myself. Maybe I was too cold, too harsh, too angry. But in therapy, I learned anger is not cruelty. Boundaries are not betrayal. Silence is not always grace. Sometimes it's self-burial. The day I began to rise was uneventful to him. He didn't notice the way I stood taller or how I started answering her questions with questions, how I didn't rush to explain myself anymore. He didn't see that I had stopped asking for permission to exist in my own home. But she saw it. Oh, she saw it. She noticed the way I pulled away from her stories, how I stopped letting her hold the baby during her unsolicited advice speeches, how I didn't laugh at her jabs just to keep the peace. She noticed and she panicked, because for the first time her control wasn't working. So she turned up the volume, she wept. On cue, accused me of turning her son against her, of isolating him from his family, of poisoning their bond. She cried in his arms, clutching her pearls and whispering the same script she had recited for years. And this time he asked me directly, "Why do you hate my mother so much?" And I didn't even blink. I said I don't hate her. I see her, and I won't bow to her anymore. He stared at me like I was someone else, and maybe I was. Because the woman who used to cower to bend to tiptoe, she was gone. Replaced by someone who didn't flinch when accused. Someone who didn't justify her boundaries like they were crimes. Someone who was done auditioning for a role she never wanted, the perfect daughter-in-law. It was around then that I started writing again. Nothing public, just pages, journals, letters I'd never send. I wrote about her not to villainize her, but to purge her. To remove the rot from my mind the way you clean a wound so it doesn't fester. I wrote until the words no longer tasted like blood, until her name didn't burn on my tongue, until I could say mother-in-law without feeling small. And the more I wrote, the more I remembered who I was. I remembered the woman I was before I became his wife or her threat. I remembered what it felt like to be held without tension, to speak without being dissected, to live without someone lurking in every corner of my joy. And I decided I would not be anyone's villain, but I could be her ending. It happened slowly, like the way winter turns into spring, not with a declaration, but with one bloom, then another, until the cold realizes it's been replaced. She didn't know she was losing, because women like her only understand war when it's loud. And I had mastered the art of quiet rebellion. No more bending, no more dinners where I let her rewrite the truth. No more playing hostess while she played executioner with a smile. I stopped attending the performances, stopped responding to her bait, stopped handing her pieces of myself just to prove I meant well. Because meaning well doesn't matter to people who need you to fail to feel powerful. She cornered me once, in the kitchen, said, "You've changed, you used to be sweet." And I said, "No, I used to be silent." She flinched, because she had built an entire narrative around my passivity. And now I was speaking, and worse, I was calm. You want to unravel someone like her, don't yell, don't cry. Just stop playing the game. The final shift came the day I invited her over for tea. I set the table, the good china, candles, lavender in the air. She thought it was a truce, but it was a eulogy. She sat across from me, smug, ready to bask in her version of winning. I poured the tea, stirred the honey, and looked her in the eye. And then I told her the truth. I told her I saw every manipulation, every twist of the knife behind her delicate words. Every time she pretended I was too emotional, too modern, too cold, too much. How she created chaos and played savior. How she pitted him against me not to protect him, but to keep him hers. I told her I no longer needed her to like me. That her approval had become irrelevant the day I decided I would rather be free than be accepted. She tried to interrupt. I raised one hand, just one, and said, "I'm not here for a dialogue. This is a boundary." The silence that followed was holy. Because power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks softly and makes no room for interruption. She stood, tried to regain footing, said something about family and respect and loyalty. I just sipped my tea. Because loyalty built on fear is not family, it's imprisonment. And I was done being the polite prisoner in her castle of control. That night, I told him she would no longer be welcome in our home, not until she learned to treat me like a human being. Not a threat, not an outsider, not a villain in her personal mythology. He told me I was forcing him to choose. And I said no, she did. He packed a bag that night. Not because I screamed, not because I threatened, but because I stopped pleading. And men like him only stay when you beg. I sat on the edge of our bed, the space beside me still warm, and felt more peace in that moment than I had in years. Not because I was alone, but because I was no longer being erased inside my own life. I slept soundly, first time in months. No footsteps outside the door, no tension thick as fog. Just quiet and my name returning to me. He was gone, just like that. A suitcase of guilt and avoidance, and the door closed with the quiet finality of a man too weak to love anyone who wouldn't shrink. I didn't chase him, didn't text, didn't cry into the floor. I fed my daughter. I read her stories. I folded the laundry he left behind and placed it neatly by the door like the chapter it represented finished. Because what he didn't understand was that when a woman stops fighting, it's not surrender. It's self-rescue. She reached out a week later. Of course she did. Her message read like a sermon full of virtue and veiled barbs. She said I was destroying the family, that I had broken his spirit, that my daughter would suffer for my pride. And I just stared at the screen, still, blank, unbothered. Because when you finally see the magician's hands, the trick loses all its power. She was trying to guilt me into submission, but I no longer recognized her spell. I left her on red. That was the ending she deserved. A month passed, then two. He didn't come home. She didn't stop. She told mutual friends I was unstable. She hinted I was keeping his child from him. She spun stories where she was the saint who had tried to hold the family together while I tore it limb from limb with my independence. I let her talk, because women like her always reveal themselves when you give them silence. Meanwhile, I began rebuilding, not just my home but my voice. I made new routines, painted the walls, put up art she would have sneered at, reclaimed the corners of the house where I used to hide from her disapproval. And my daughter, she laughed more, slept better, started drawing pictures of just us two figures holding hands under the sun. There was no space for toxicity in her imagination anymore. And I would keep it that way. One day she showed up, unannounced again, but this time I didn't open the door. I let her ring the bell, knock, wait. And when I finally opened it just a crack, I said, "You're not welcome here. This isn't your stage anymore." She blinked, tried to play fragile, tried to tremble the way women like her do when their control slips. But I was done performing. She said, "You turned my son against me." I said no. I turned myself back into someone I could live with. Then I closed the door. Not with anger, not with drama, just with finality. Because not all battles need to end in blood. Some end in locked doors and the sound of a woman choosing peace. That was the last time she tried to come inside. She sent messages, asked for second chances, said she wanted to see her granddaughter. And I didn't forbid it. I just made the rules. If she wanted to be part of our lives, she would need to learn something she had spent her whole life avoiding. Respect. No more jabs. No more subtle sabotage. No more using my child as a pawn in her grief narrative. Just honesty, boundaries, or distance. She didn't respond well. She never met a boundary she didn't try to break. But now I had a different kind of power. I didn't need to explain myself anymore. I was no longer a character in her drama, no longer the villain in her script. I was the author now, and I was writing my own ending. I used to think revenge would feel like thunder, loud, righteous, explosive. But it didn't. It felt like silence, like the kind that fills a room when a storm passes and nothing is left standing but the truth. She didn't change. People like her rarely do. But I did. I stopped asking people to see what was right in front of them, stopped handing out chances like confetti, stopped auditioning for a seat at tables built to collapse beneath me. I chose my own table, set it with peace, and only invited those who knew how to sit without drawing blood. He came back once, not to stay, just to ask if things could go back. I didn't ask back to what, because I knew. He wanted the version of me who apologized for breathing, who made space for his mother's poison, who folded herself small enough to fit the space between their codependence. But that woman was gone. She had burned at the altar of becoming. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not a monster but a man afraid to unlearn. And I said there is no going back, only forward, and I'm already ahead. My daughter asked about him once. We were making pancakes. She stirred while I cracked the eggs, and she looked up and said, "Was Daddy ever nice to you?" I paused. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to give her truth without giving her bitterness. I said he tried, but he didn't know how to love someone who wouldn't disappear for him. She nodded, like she understood, like something deep in her little body already knew what it meant to protect your own fire. Years passed, and the story faded into something distant, not forgotten, just archived, a chapter in a book I no longer reread. But one day I found the old letters, the journals, the pages I wrote in secret during the war she waged on my sanity. And I thought maybe one day my daughter will read them, not to hate, not to hurt, but to know. To know what survival looks like with mascara smudged and a baby on your hip. To know how soft strength can be, to know that being called a villain by the wrong people can be the beginning of your most powerful truth. I didn't get revenge, not in the way people expect. I didn't ruin her, didn't turn her family against her, didn't expose her lies at a crowded dinner table with receipts and fury. No, I just lived freely, boldly, without her in the room. And that was enough. Because nothing haunts a woman obsessed with control more than watching the person she tried to break live untouched by her hands. She exists now in photos, in holidays I no longer attend, in stories my daughter will one day hear and filter through the lens of a mother who chose dignity over drama. And when she asks what happened, I'll tell her this. There are women who survive storms and women who become them. I became the storm she never saw coming, not with thunder, but with stillness. So no, I'm not the villain. I'm the woman who left before she disappeared completely. I'm the mother who broke the cycle before it wrapped around another generation. I'm the wife who chose herself in a house built to swallow her. And that is the ending she never saw coming. Not a scream, not a slam of the door, just a woman still tall and unbothered, writing the last page with her own hand,